In 1997, CBS launched the first online fantasy football service. Ever since then, every single NFL fan has a fantasy performance from one of their favorite players that sticks out in their mind. Maybe it was when Tyreek Hill had 269 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns versus the Buccaneers in 2020, or just last season when Jonathan Taylor ran for 204 yards and 5 touchdowns versus the Bills. Most recently, Joe Mixon went off and put up 55.1 fantasy points in his dominant Week 9 performance against the Panthers. This will likely be the most productive fantasy performance from a player in 2022, but it is not even a top 5 fantasy performance from a running back in the last 20 years. This is where the video starts. Some of you may remember Doug Martin. He was drafted in the first round of the 2012 draft by the Buccaneers and had a breakout rookie season where he had 1,454 rushing yards, 11 rushing touchdowns, 472 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown. In week 8 of his rookie season, he had the 5th greatest fantasy performance from a running back ever. He dominated the Raiders in a 42-32 win, posting 251 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns, with 4 catches for 21 yards. This amounted to 55.2 fantasy points in PPR formats. That performance put Doug Martin in the fantasy football history books, but unfortunately for him, he missed 38 games over the course of his 7-year career and never really had a chance to replicate this Week 8 performance consistently. This brings me to the 4th greatest single game fantasy performance from a running back ever. In 2009, during Chris Johnson's 2,000-yard campaign, he ran for 197 yards, 2 touchdowns, with 9 catches, 87 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown. He totaled 55.4 fantasy points that week, and in the context of his 2009 season, I think the production is even more impressive because he went on to have games like that consistently, allowing him to reach that 2,000-yard rushing mark. It sucks that people seem to forget just how good he was when he played for the Titans, and they lose sight of this historic performance. Now, we have possibly the most important performance from a running back on this list, given the context of how fantasy football works. During week 16 of the 2020 NFL season, when many fantasy football championships are being played, Alvin Kamara put on a fantasy performance for the ages, guaranteeing his fantasy managers their league championships, assuming they made it there. If you were in your league championship in 2020 and had Alvin Kamara on your roster, you were guaranteed a victory. He broke the record for most rushing yards in a single game with 6 versus the Vikings, effectively also ruining the Vikings' 2020 season as they watched the 8-8 Bears go to the playoffs. To give you his full stat line this game, he totaled 155 rushing yards, 6 touchdowns, with 3 catches for 17 yards. This finished the game with 56.2 PPR fantasy points. Now, the 2nd greatest single game fantasy performance ever from a running back, we have to go a little further back in history to the early days of online fantasy football. In 2003, Clinton Portis had the greatest single game statistical performance from a running back ever at that point in time. During week 13 of the 2003 season, he posted 218 rushing yards, 5 rushing touchdowns, with 2 catches for 36 yards. That added up to 57.4 PPR fantasy points, and for those that are still living in the ancient past of non-PPR fantasy football, this performance would be the greatest running back performance in that category. Now, the greatest fantasy performance from a running back in NFL history, and it is quite possibly the strangest stat line you could see from a running back, given the fact that you're usually expected to see 200 plus rushing yards with 3 rushing touchdowns up on the stat sheet in a performance of this magnitude. In this game, Jamal Charles didn't do anything all that impressive from a rushing perspective. He only averaged 2.5 yards a carry for 20 yards with 1 rushing touchdown, but he was Christian McCaffrey before Christian McCaffrey became well known for being that dual threat running back. During week 15 of the 2013 season, which was either the semifinals or championship for most fantasy owners, Jamal Charles caught 8 passes for 195 yards and 4 touchdowns. Just think about how crazy that is. A running back only ran for 20 yards, but had 195 receiving yards with 4 touchdowns. It is truly unfortunate that Jamal Charles was never able to play in Andy Reid's offense alongside Patrick Mahomes. Before I finish this video, there is one performance I want to mention because although it took place when fantasy football didn't even exist, it deserves recognition. If your running back put up this statistical performance in today's fantasy football landscape, you would be jumping for joy and automatically win your week matchup. In 1961, during week 14 of the NFL season, Billy Cannon ran for 216 yards on 25 attempts for 3 touchdowns with an additional 114 yards receiving on 5 catches and 2 receiving touchdowns. That stat line equals 68 fantasy points in PPR formats. This is the greatest statistical performance from a running back ever, so I felt it needed to be included even if it happened 60 years ago. Those are the 5 greatest fantasy football football performances from a running back in a single game all time. Let me know the most memorable fantasy performances a player had on your team, and did it help your team win the fantasy championship that year? Like the video, subscribe to our channel, and we will see you later this week with more content.